Everyone, and welcome to tonight's lecture, which is entitled Speculative Urbanism and the New Volatility of City Life. And this is a lecture within the series The Great Crisis of Capitalism. My name is Tine Hanrieder. I'm the head of the Junior Research Group Global Humanitarian Medicine here at the WZB, and I'm moderating tonight. I'm very happy to welcome our speaker, Michael Goldman, who will give the talk about the financialization of cities, and also our commentator, Reverend Sebastian Botzem from University of Bremen and Free University Berlin. So I now just introduce both of them very quickly so that we have a lot of time for Michael's presentation and Sebastian's comments, and then for discussion with you and wine and pretzels. So Michael Goldman came from the University of Minnesota, where he's an associate professor of sociology and global studies. And he works on themes like transnational sociology and development, and environmentalism is also one of his themes, financialization, financial institutions, and then questions of infrastructure, land, but also cities, and especially world-class cities such as Berlin. I guess that's why he's here. He got his PhD in sociology from the University of California, Santa Cruz. And his first book was entitled Imperial Nature, and a long subtitle, The World Bank and the Struggle for Social Justice in the Age of Globalization. And that's basically a book that gives you an inside view of the World Bank and what development does, and especially what it means to green development, so how it is made, what the environmental term means, and what it means for the people who experience these policies. And this book also won the American Sociological Association's award in the section Political Economy of World Systems. A lot of Michael's work draws on extensive research experience in India and Bangalore, and there he has recently been awarded the V.K.R.V. Rao Chair Professor Award at the Institute of Social and Economic Change, which is based in Bangalore, India. And also in his other publications, articles, but also creative works, he has contributed to these themes and on ethnography more generally, and how to study globalization in different local places where it has its repercussions. Sebastian Botzem is a professor at the Institute of Intercultural and International Studies at the Universität Bremen, and currently he is an acting professor at the Free University Berlin for International Political Economy. And there he also got his PhD. He leads a research project based in Bremen about transnational ordering in financial markets, and he has published also widely on financialization, economic governance at the transnational level, accounting as well, and that's also what his monograph from 2012 was about, the politics of accounting regulation, organizing transnational standard setting in financial reporting. And Sebastian is coming home today because between 2008 and 2014 he worked at the WZB. So he left when I came. But Michael, thank you for bringing him back to Berlin, and thanks very much for coming over, and we look forward to your presentation.
Excuse me, I'm a heavy drinker. A little jet lag, so I might be reading this, but I just wanted to thank you all for coming. I mean, personally, I would be out on the riverside in one of those lounge chairs drinking a beer, but as I really appreciate that you came today, and I hope it was worth your while. And I just want to thank the center, the staff, Tina, Dieter, and Sebastian coming from so far away, maybe not so far, but to actually pay attention and throw out some provocative questions. I really appreciate it. So let me just get started. And if I run out of time, I'm going to cut the Berlin section because it's probably something you all know more than I. But I think you might hear the trope of what's happening in Berlin through my discussion of what's happening around the world. And that's my question to you. You know, how well does this resonate? Having had the great fortune of living in the US, Spain, and India, is this okay, sound-wise? During the immediate afterlife of the global financial crisis of 2008, I noticed how differently the event had been portrayed and experienced in each place, and yet how very much linked each experience was. And by the way, I apologize for not speaking German here. Please indulge me. In the US, the question quickly became, where will we find the financial capital to run our cities? As our major financial institutions were collapsing left and right, all proclaiming that they had no working capital and no way to go forward. In India, by stark contrast, those very same firms were busily and loudly setting up the first ever India infrastructure funds, comprised of capital they raised from around the world in search of big urban projects to invest in. At the time, I had embarked on a research project following the story in India that the government and the World Bank and others were touting as an urban revolution, to build, quote, 100 global cities in the next few decades, echoing a similar promise that came from the Chinese government a few years earlier. So always, second fiddle India. So I settled into Bangalore to understand what it meant there, since it was expanding rapidly with, the information technology sector. Bangalore was assigned, the moniker, the IT city of Asia. Within a short time, images circulated of large-scale new cities in China, built but empty of people. While in India, there were 10,000 protests from farmers refusing to give up their land for, quote, the good of the nation, refusing to be sacrificed on the altar of this new religion that spoke of cities as the new saviors to help countries become powerful in the global economy, as well as solve their national problems of growing inequality. That is, the discourse of global urbanism, I'm suggesting you could find at PricewaterhouseCoopers, at Goldman Sachs, as well as the World Bank and various UN agencies, that if we invest in our cities, particularly in the global south, we can sort of leapfrog over our long-term third world problems and be able to better integrate into the global economy. So I went to Bangalore with the idea of conducting research to understand that discourse, but also the practices on the ground. Now, amidst the protests throughout India, that is, rural farmers refusing to give up their land for urban real estate, I read about how, from Singapore, Sovereign Wealth Fund was building a new city in one part of India, and the Japanese investment funds were financing a series of cities between Delhi and Bombay, while Blackstone, this once obscure private equity firm based in New York, that I think some of you might have heard of in Berlin, was buying up empty office buildings across the subcontinent. So why is there so much capital, I wondered, flowing into Indian cities, while back in America, old bridges were collapsing, broken water systems were delivering toxic water? That is, Minneapolis, the bridges were collapsing, and Detroit, the toxic water. Now, stuck in the trenches of my research in Bangalore, I came to realize that I had to sort of buck the trend of scholarship, of becoming a so-called expert of one place, when it was clear that the financing of this city was closely linked to finance capital's workings elsewhere, that I needed to avoid what we call methodological nationalism, thinking that a site like a city or a national economy or a nation state can exist in isolation from a larger whole, when in fact the actual workings of finance capital depend upon the free circulation across cities and across national borders. So the idea is, instead of following the instincts of political science or sociology and stay within a national borders, I followed the money, which was finance capital. Though right-wing populism is frightened of the movement of people across borders, there's not enough deep relational analysis of the processes creating such great turbulence in our cities. That is, it's not being created by workers moving from place to place, but from the specific segment of capital, finance capital, private equity firms. In fact, the punchline of the talk today, if you're not staying till the end, is that over the past 20 or so years, finance capital has transformed the global economy, I assert, such that it primarily profits from creating value in motion, circulating across sites, and in its path, creating intense volatility and dispossession, even as it is portrayed by governments as the only hope to overcome the crisis it itself creates. Why did we turn to finance capital, financial firms, after the financial crisis when in fact they created it? So there's something about the persuasive nature of finance as a solution, somehow apolitically, of our national problems, that we retreated to the idea that we have to rely on finance after the financial crisis. So this is a talk about the afterlife of the crisis. So I'm arguing that the financial capital profits through its circulation in and out of cities by getting guaranteed, de-risked invitations by governments to invest locally, and makes it profits from its quick exits. And that the differences in times and places across the global map teach us much about how finance capital profits so handsomely and how brutally dependent that profit is on the dispossession of various forms, which I'll explain. This trend is what I call speculative urbanism, seductive to some but destructive to many. Now, in the rest of my talk, I will reduce all this clutter of information to 5 basic characteristics of what I see as finance capital's work in our cities globally, plucking out examples from the US, Spain, India, and if I have time, Berlin. So at the risk of simplifying, hopefully I won't be presenting it simplistic, but 5 characteristics. Oh, before we get there, I just wanted to highlight that one of the sites that I've been studying empirically is the sort of mustard-colored northern part of Bangalore. And if you look at the center circle, that was the size of Bangalore up until recently. And then the decision was made that if it wanted to become a global city, or to become a global city, it needed to expand outward. So the kind of grayish area was the newly designed municipality, the greater Bangalore region, which incorporated a few hundred villages and towns, and 7 or 8 towns. So the important part to think about is how important rural land is to the making of the city in this case. And then the mustard area is what I call the airport area. That little airplane is the one runway, tiny international airport. But the airport, the investors required thousands of acres of land, rural land, given to them if they were to invest in the airport, acknowledging that the airport itself is not profitable to the investors. So land had to be given, which I'll explain again in a minute. And then the IT corridor and then this other infrastructure corridor are what I'm calling the kind of world city projects, infrastructure projects that are completely transforming the city. And if you add up all the acres, it's larger than the city itself. So the idea is to expand, create new peripheral cities is the way we will make this city global and then make India better integrated into the global economy. And land is the key issue. Okay. And just to give you, out of the airplane, I took a shot of how fertile the land is where the airport area was to be included. And in the foreground, you might not be able to see it, is already cleared farms for industrial development or residential complexes. And this is the land, just to appreciate. And just before I get to my themes, just to highlight that this was a model villa that I went to visit right near the airport with the intention of perhaps buying. But when I arrived, this is on 1/10 of an acre, so we're just measuring everything in acres. A plot of land that a farmer had sold in the late 90s, required to sell because the government insisted that the airport region be developed into an urban site, was given approximately 8,000 $8,000 an acre, which is, I don't know, what is it, like 7,000 euro or whatever, almost 8,000 euro per acre. But this particular villa was being sold for $850,000 on 1/10 of that acre. So there's something about the magic of the market that I wanted to investigate to understand how a rural farmer is given considered just compensation, $7,000, the true value of land when it's owned by a farmer, and the next day it's worth, well, millions of dollars when it becomes urban real estate. And I think it behooves us to understand the magic of the market. It's Houdini-like in its magic. Okay, life looks better when viewed from the top. So I think we should get down to the brass tacks. And this is not a spectacle. These are actually pictures from the newspaper last year. Tamil Nadu, which is the neighboring state to where Bangalore is, So much of their land is being, people are being forced off their land in order to sell to urban real estate developers, that literally hundreds of farmers transported themselves to New Delhi, the capital, and basically performed how they feel their lives have become. This is not an art presentation. This is literally farmers holding on to live rats and presenting themselves in a manner such that suicide was the only alternative. And in fact, the suicide rates outside of Bangalore and in the Tamil Nadu area are the highest in the century. And there's a direct connection between the story I'm telling and their serious consequences. So although I won't go much into the farmers' lives, I just wanted to highlight that this is in the daily news, at least in India. Okay, back to the abstract academic side. So these are the 5 characteristics, and I'll go through them one at a time, okay? I won't even read them now, so we won't waste our time. But I'll start with the first one. The first one is monopolization and market making, okay? I start with this characteristic to highlight that the afterlife of the financial crisis is not just about individuals' housing, mortgage, debt issues, but also about government. Government agencies, municipalities, that is city governments, many of which are broke and thus have to borrow from international capital markets. Its features can be seen through the following illustration, which I present from the United States, which is called an interest rate swap. It's a financial tool that financial firms invented and monopolized. That is, they own full control over. It has brought them huge rewards, but at a cost to city governments throughout the US. And so what this highlights is, and I'll read it in a second, but the part about monopolization is that 4 firms controlled basically 95% of this investment tool, financial tool called interest rate swaps, which I'll explain in a second. And these are the 4 firms, which are all well known. Meanwhile, 7 cities in California, as a consequence of this financial tool, this loan, have filed for bankruptcy. Of the 77 cities in California that are, quote, economically challenged today. Even though, as you may know, California is on its own the 5th largest economy in the world. So how can there be so much wealth and so much debt? On the theme of monopolization and market making, I just wanted to highlight, this is every quarter in the New York Times, they have a particular chart which highlights the top financial deals around the world. And I just want to highlight in terms of mergers and acquisition, which is a big financial tool around the world, and it's happening actually in companies in Berlin right now, is that the top 5 companies, if you look on the right-hand side of market share, actually comprise more than 115% of the deals in that quarter globally. Now, how can it be 115%? It doesn't make sense, right? It's because many of these companies, like Goldman Sachs, oftentimes advises on both sides of a deal. So cities hire Goldman Sachs to give them advice, and the advice is buy an interest rate swap. That's the best deal we have to offer. And at the same time, they're formulating the tool, which they then sell. So it's possible for 5 firms globally to control 120% of all the deals in the world, just to give you a sense of how small and intimate this world of finance capital is, okay? This is not, somebody created, some network analysis freak, created like all kind of global corporate transactions in 2008, right before the financial crisis. And I don't mean to say it that way, but came up with this diagram which shows you the key nodal points of not financial transactions, but corporate transactions, and found that almost all of them are financial institutions. So we imagine Apple, Mercedes-Benz, I don't know, what's your favorite company? Yeah, Jaguar? Oh, Google. Oh, yeah. I saw the graffiti about Google. And the consequences of this monopolization and this market making is that in the United States, you can see since the 1950s, the upward arrow, if you will, is corporate profits from the financial sector, and the downward arrow is manufacturing. So though we imagine we go to work to produce things, even ideas, right? In fact, today, the lion's share of corporate profit in the United States is from the financial world, which is through the circulation of money, making money from money. Okay? So just to give you one quick example about interest rate swaps, in the 1990s, a sort of depressed city called Stockton, California, on a basin of water, borrowed to rebuild its crumbling city hall and constructed what financial advisors suggested would be a riverside renaissance. And if anyone's been here, there's no renaissance for this sad town. But the idea was to borrow millions of dollars to build a tourist site along a river to generate tourist revenue, a seemingly improbable ambition for this city. But instead of using traditional municipal bonds or federal or state-backed support to raise money cheaply, the city's financial advisors offered Stockton this gamble that interest rates would soon rise. I won't go into the details, but interest rates were at zero in the United States in the 90s and 2000s. And the financial advisors would say, hey, we're going to do a swap, which is that you base your loan on the future interest rate that will exist, because we know interest rates are going to go up across the country. And of course, the Secretary of Treasury is also from Goldman Sachs, and the advisors are from Goldman Sachs. And lo and behold, for 10 years, the interest rate didn't go up. It was still at zero. And because of that, because of the complexity, the esoteric nature of the deal, those cities that thought that the interest rates would go up lost hundreds of millions of dollars. I mean, it's like a casino, but these are real cities. And the point that I want to make is that in the United States, and I think it's true throughout Europe and most of the world, that up until the 1980s, when cities began to become liberalized, it meant that central governments would no longer lend to cities for projects, for long-term projects like bridges, schools, what have you. And the idea was that cities would become more efficient and disciplined if they borrowed from international capital markets. Because if you always borrowed from the central government, then there's politics, there's inefficiency, there's bureaucracy. So why not borrow from a pure market, right? The belief of a pure market. Where's Hayek here? And that is international capital markets, right? Because you have thousands of possible lenders, right? And a city will always find the most efficient deal. Well, and so governments were following that advice and liberalizing cities such that cities had to borrow from international capital markets if they wanted to rebuild. So instead of having a $30 to 40 year loan, a very low interest from your own government, instead you're borrowing from Merrill Lynch. And they're creating the financial tools, and so that's why I'm suggesting they make that market. And they monopolize it at the same time. As a consequence, the New York City Metro Transit Authority, which also borrowed money to rebuild this dilapidated subway in New York, ended up having to pay billions of dollars just to get out of the contract when the workers had found out that they had this horrible deal with the financial Wall Street, which is right in town. And they ended up having to terminate the contract of this financial deal. They had to pay something like $1.5 billion to terminate the deal, which meant that they had to lay off 2,000 employees and raise the fare 60%, and they could never actually fix the subway. And if anybody's taken the subway, you know the consequences. So the deal was made in the first place to raise capital to rebuild infrastructure, and yet at a time when finance capital, was made scarce, such that they had no choice but to borrow under this particular tool. So I'm trying to highlight the way markets are made by an oligopoly or a monopoly of a series of actors. Unlike what we're learning in basic neoclassical economics, my apology to the economists, that the markets are infinite, particularly when we're talking about global capital, right? Okay. So, protest. Halftime. Oh my gosh. Should we take a break? So the second point is, and I'll try to speed up a little bit, is the second characteristic, which is the state guarantees these deals. So the state is not the neoliberal state that seems to disappear, but it actively engages and seeks advice from financial advisors. And the second point is that capital pursues what I call an arbitrage across cities. So when Berlin or when Bangalore is looking for money to borrow, investors are comparing the deal that the city was willing to take with a city elsewhere. So that's what we call arbitrage, which is always looking simultaneously for the best price. Now, Berlin or Bangalore does not have the choices of comparing JP Morgan to Citibank or Deutsche Bank because they all offer the same deal. But on the contrast, these particular financial institutions can pit one city against another to get to allow them to take a financial deal that might end up benefiting the investors. And in fact, at business meetings that I would attend, there were sovereign wealth fund owners who would say, why should we pull our money out of the US or Europe when we secure 12% annual rates of return in our investment, unless we can get a guarantee of 20 to 25% rates in risky India? So when I was attending a meeting in New Delhi, the government officials were sitting right alongside Citibank and Deutsche Bank and others, listening to this question is, if you want to borrow to build power plants or highways or airports, you have to guarantee us a profit rate better than what we can get in Europe. And that's what we call arbitrage. And as a consequence, a lot of cities went bankrupt. And now I'm sort of jumping because I'm running out of time. But this is the coastal line of Spain, which actually a lot of German investors and British investors invested in before the financial crisis. And all these buildings, of course, are empty. And one of the next points that I want to make is what's supremely valuable of financial investment is that it always remains liquid, whereas that which we invest in is concrete and illiquid, which is we can't get our money out of these buildings when they go bankrupt, as so much of the Spanish who invested in these buildings did. But the investors are always able to remain liquid. This is Spain. Public housing. Most of public housing in Madrid was sold to Goldman Sachs and Blackstone after the financial crisis. So another aspect of this arbitrage, which I want to highlight but not go into detail, is when the Spanish government went broke because of the financial crisis. And you had all these empty construction, half-built stadiums. There's a third airport in Valencia that still has not opened. All the speculation around infrastructure. The investors had written into the contract with the government, because these are public infrastructure, that that the government had to guarantee a certain rate of use, that is, revenues, that would circulate through those airports or stadiums down to something like 50%. And below that, the government would have to pay back the investors. And so after the financial crisis, the toll roads remained empty, the stadium half built, and the airport unused. And so even though the financial crisis had hit, the government in the contract had paid off the investors all the lost revenues of that unfinished infrastructure. And the arbitrage part of this point is that the investors were free to reinvest that money wherever they wanted to, and they did not invest in Spain. Why should they? It was broke. So they invested in Latin America, because at the time, Brazil, compelled to build its global infrastructure, right? World Cup and Olympics, remember from not so long ago, ran out of money. And so the major Spanish banks, BBVA, which is partly owned by Deutsche Bank, Santander, invested or lent money to the infrastructure in Brazil, which was hopelessly behind. And made, and I won't go into the details, but the kind of profit rate they made from taking money from Spain and moving it to Latin America shows you how, in a sense, valuable finance capital is. But also, the point that I'm trying to make is that the state guarantees this kind of arbitrage across borders, guaranteeing the profit rate, which even undermines, basic elements of society. The third point, is what is a complicated term called assetization. Anybody know what that means? Which is basically turning things into an asset. And it emphasizes this point that I was just making, which is that, where's my definition? Which is that what finance capital creates and invests in is a revenue stream. So when they build that housing or when they build that infrastructure, what they're looking, or when they lend you money for a house, what they're looking for is the rental payments, the monthly mortgage payments, or the monthly government payments back into that infrastructure, and they turn the future of the revenue stream into an asset, which they then sell on the international market. They don't sell the concrete, they don't own the infrastructure. What they own is, because they created it, the right to sell the future appreciation of the value of that thing. Okay, so they don't own the thing; they own this imaginary world of which 2/3 of financial profits come from, which is what's called hedges and derivatives, which is the future of that revenue stream. So when they buy 1,000 homes, I'll give you an example. In my town, Minneapolis, after the financial crisis, more than 1,000 homes were left bankrupt, mostly African Americans. Those houses were foreclosed. That created a market of foreclosed homes, which a private equity firm called Blackstone bought at pennies to the dollar because they were bankrupt and empty. And so they created a market of foreclosed homes, which they then turned into rental homes. Okay? So now in Minneapolis, and it's true in Berlin, right? The squeeze on rental homes are such that rents have gone up dramatically. But that's not where they make their profit. Where they make their profit is they sell to, and it's the leading buyer is Deutsche Bank. I mean, I just happen to be in Germany, but it happens to be a global bank. Invest in what's called a rental home securitization bond, which if you Google, it may give you more details as to what it is. Basically, the future revenue of those 1,000 homes has been securitized into a bond and thrown out into the market, which now banks and institutional investors are investing in, such that our pension funds are making 4, 5, 6% rates of return. Does that make sense? It's kind of crazy. But it's called assetization and liquidation, which means that they don't own the house, nor do you because you're bankrupt. But what they do is they use that as an opportunity to create a revenue stream. And Blackstone now owns, and I'll tell you in a second, houses and office space all over the world, which then we anticipate that the rents will go up because Blackstone wouldn't buy it if they couldn't raise the rents. And it's that future appreciation which it's selling high value in securitized bonds around the world. And Deutsche Bank first bought at the original, 6 years ago when this first was invented, $500 million, and they expect it'll be a $7 trillion industry in 10 years. Okay. Does that baffle you? Does it? Sorry, a lot of information about obscure, but it behooves us to learn this obscurity, right? Because it's affecting what's happening on the ground. How much time do I have? Oh, okay. I can go backwards then. Any questions? So I have many. So, fortunately, Spain is, Spanish cities are incredibly well organized. I think Berlin might be in parallel to that. And so there's a very successful movement to anti-eviction movement, which they actually have highlighted Blackstone because between Blackstone, Goldman Sachs, and KKR, they've bought up hundreds of thousands of units across Spain, particularly public housing. Why public housing? Because the government's broke. So they basically gave them the public housing and told them to do with it what they can, which is now part of this assetization process. Okay, I want to get to the last 2 points. Oh, and finally, just because I was living in Bangalore, what's so amazing to me as I'm reading this in the news is that between these 2 years of 2014 and 2016, which was a real bust for the Indian economy because economies go like this, and remember, finance capital does not make money when the economy is stable. So the volatility of the economy offered them a deal such that Blackstone invested $2 billion in just 2 years in India. That's a lot of money. I mean, even here. to become the largest office landlord in India across Delhi, Bombay, Gurgaon, Bangalore, bought depressed assets, and now are watching the rents going up. Why? Because they are the monopolized landlord. But they're not making their money just on the rent. They're making the money off selling this as a global asset. They see the debt crisis as an enormous value opportunity, right? So Blackstone invested $2 billion for more than 30 million square feet of office space. Now, developers who sold these buildings speculated on the future of the Indian economy as it was collapsing, and so the developers were going bankrupt. And so the only way that developers could stay afloat, to continue to build or to finish building or to stay alive, is that they had to buy land. So what they did was they went on a rampage, if you will, to figure out all the particular ways, which I'll explain right now, to access rural land, to use not to build housing, but use as collateral to pay off its debts. And that's why financial institutions were coming to India, is to use the land as collateral, because if you look at the Indian economy, as it has become extremely volatile, the one thing that's gone straight up is Indian land values, and in part because of this process, okay? So I want to get to my last 2 points, okay, and then I'll stop. Assetization? What did I say? Collateral. Collateral for the debt that they owe to the financial institutions. So
it's in the ground of the big sites is the money wash.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there you go. So I'm going to connect that to this idea of the centrality of dispossession. I mean, this is in Spain, but it could be anywhere in the world. So the last 2 points are connected. The centrality of dispossession to create the depressed and cheapened asset price to guarantee investor profits. So the important point that I'm trying to highlight is that rural land, in the case of India, but let's say outside of Berlin, is only valuable if the state depresses the value of the rural. If the people, the farmers in the case of Bangalore, and I don't know what your rural is like today, but if they were given a piece of the action of the value of the urban real estate, because it is their land, then there's no reason why Goldman Sachs or Deutsche Bank would be interested. It's only because the state guarantees the depression of the value of that land. That is, rural land is not worth much on the international market, but urban land is. It's the same piece of soil, right? But once it becomes circulating as part of urban real estate, so the point that I'm trying to make is the centrality of dispossession in order to create that profit. It's not the magic of the market. It's the brutal force of the state and the working with finance to ensure that certain assets become devalued, like housing in Madrid after the financial crisis. Because just as easily, we could decide that public housing is the most valuable asset in Berlin today, right? It's a social issue, and yet it becomes reduced and declared that it is a financial issue, that only experts can figure out how to best create value rather than we, right? So if the fourth characteristic is centrality of dispossession, the fifth characteristic, I hope is not too esoteric, is what Thomas Piketty called the patrimonial regime of actors. And that is the people on the ground who are mobilizing the power to actually expel and to create the local expertise and the discourse that this is the way in which cities should grow, by collecting depressed assets in the countryside. Does that make sense or no? So here's outside of Bangalore near the airport, and this woman, Muniana, basically was forced to sell her farmland because it was going to become the runway to the airport, okay? She's a Dalit, a low-caste farmer. 75% of the farmers in the area around the airport, people ask, why did they put the airport on the northern part of Bangalore and not other parts? 75% of the population were Dalits, low-caste, easily pushed around, a minority, or actually majority, of the population. So her family was given just a few $1,000s to build the runway. She was given this small plot of land by the government, And because she had no money, because they didn't give her family farmland, she immediately sold her house to a Bangalore speculator. And instead, she moved in and her family to the cowshed. So this is one form of dispossession. It's not that they lost everything, but you can see the way in which the rural gets manipulated in order to make this a future attraction to urban investors. As well, they were left to farming the road, the side of the road. This is illegally, because they weren't given farmland. And this is the local town. Next to the 7-star airport and the IT corridor you can see there's no infrastructure investment in where the average Indian lives, as well as the pastoralists. So these are different forms of dispossession I wanted to highlight. Because the city of Bangalore went bankrupt, it had to use as collateral its public market spaces, gave to the banks. And they're going to turn this into a shopping mall. So you can see the vitality of a life, the way in which all different classes can actually survive the living in an Indian city become completely expelled when you have this kind of financial logic and speculation. And this has become the new corporate commons, which is a hospital at the one end, a hotel at the other, a shopping mall, and that's the World Trade Center, which 2/3 of the office space is owned by Amazon. Anyway, the last point I just want to highlight, because I think it shouldn't go unnoticed, is that global capital can't function without the people on the ground inviting them to come invest. There's no way that assets can become depressed unless there is, if you will, a comprador class in town that's willing to do the hard work. And so I'm using this phrase, the patrimonial regimes of actors, people on the ground who are actually and my friend Karen Ho, who wrote this amazing book called Liquidated, an ethnography of Wall Street, she came up with this term, which I'm stealing from her with her permission, called a racialized fraternal network. That when she studied Wall Street in New York, she said she couldn't help, she's Chinese American, she couldn't help notice that everybody looked like that. And it's not just that they went to the same Ivy League schools, they went to the same cocktail bars, they worked at the same firms, rotating through the same 5-7 firms. So of course, there's collegiality in creating that global competitive market we call finance capital, right? But the other point that she makes that I also want to work with is that it's not that they just excluded women or minorities or working class people. It's not just about exclusion. It's that they have the power through their elite fraternal network to make markets. They're able, because of their networks in political, in parliament and through real estate agencies on the ground, local government officials, to actually make markets, make things happen on the ground, without which Goldman Sachs could never come, because they wouldn't come to India. What's interesting about Blackstone, and I'm getting to Berlin, do I have like 3 minutes or something? No. What's so interesting about it, so one of the names I highlighted is Blackstone, because 10 years ago, nobody had heard of Blackstone. It's a private equity firm. It worked, if you will, undercover, or just, it wasn't, and when they started buying up hundreds of thousands of houses in America, and then started buying hundreds of thousands of houses in Spain, one of the 31-year-old guy who was head of housing in Blackstone said, we had never done this before. We had never owned a single house until this year. Now we own millions, and we're just learning, which is pretty interesting. The largest land, if you will, homeowner in the world, in a sense, is not interested in managing your home or fixing your toilet, right? And in fact, in Blackstone, which is the largest office space owner in India today, has only 21 employees in India. The largest office space owner in India only has 21 employees. These few employees did not do the hard work on the ground to make it possible for the company to buy property, increase rents, securitize office space rents, turn them into bonds, prepare exits within a few years. It took a hell of a lot of work of people in India and beyond of the sort associated with these 5 characteristics I've outlined today to make finance capital so profitable, so powerful, and so destructive. It took people working not just at the local level, but and not just at the global, but across these platforms. Yet the debates on the ground in India, and maybe even here, focus on the deceit and the corruption of those in government in the real estate sector who are seen to be robbing people blind. But corruption may be the buzzword of the day, and hopefully there will be a reckoning. But much ignored are the structural, the cultural, the social changes that have occurred within this shared domain of finance. The mass displacement of small farmers in Bangalore could not have happened without the promise of a global city, which is, circulating. We'll skip Berlin and get to the end, because we're in Berlin. And why should we be so negative? Yeah. So our friend Karl Marx once called this sector of the economy as parasitic. That is an otherwise parasite on an otherwise production-centered economy and society. Today, I would argue that finance is not that parasite, but the foundation and the central motor of our economy. And it has quickly shaped how we experience the city, as well as our very own subjectivities as we try to navigate and survive the city that is ours, but also totally out of our control. I would further argue that this culture of what, if Foucault were alive, may call speculative governmentality has infected us, linking all corners of society, including us. What binds us is a completely unregulated, unaccounted for, untaxed, and yet held in highest repute, the shadow banking system hidden behind the magic and the mystery of the market. This racialized fraternity that comprises the elites of finance capital act with impunity, while those on the site, the landlords, the petty government officials, the parliamentarians, are being categorized as corrupt and inept. This discourse suggests there's a better, more global, apolitical way to solve the local problem, like global finance, right? So this political discourse, in my opinion, only feeds the monster. Instead, we must think about the relational dimensions that tie and bind our crises of housing, debt, shrinking public space, and access to public goods, and the huge wealth accumulation of the world's top 5% that impoverishes much of humanity. We should see this dynamic of poverty and wealth as working across North and South, and the financialization of the city as a major contributor to this violent and cavernous gap in societies. I feel we need to join the push for politics that put the rights for housing and city first, one that is attentive to the intimate connections to the dispossession of the rural, the romance of the global, the sanctity of tax-free islands that help add value to our pension funds and the state investment portfolios while undermining the places we call home. I feel we're all complicit. The first step is to better understand our entanglements and to gain a renewed sense of the public, and not as something that can be mortgaged or used as collateral, but as the basis of an urban-rural commons, based on a much more robust politics of stopping, outlawing, perhaps, finance capital, as it has become antithetical to many or most projects of social justice, including the right to the city movements everywhere. Thank you.
So thanks so much. This was so incredibly rich. I was not liking my job as a timekeeper, as you saw.
My apologies.
But I think Sebastian promised a somewhat uplifting comment.
No.
Yes.
No uplifting, sorry, but some comments. Well, first of all, thank you for the presentation, and I also had the pleasure to read a longer text, which is even more depressing in a way, so even less optimism there. But thank you for the informative, interesting, and the relevant information. For me, two insights were the most important ones. First, that the local and the global are interconnected and interdependent. One could perhaps even go so far and say there is no local without the global, and your examples show that, and the other way around. There is no global without the local, and finance shows that, and that's my second point as a finance scholar. To me personally, that was uplifting. You see finance in places where you fear it is, but where you don't necessarily look for it, but it's still there, and you show very nicely how that works. I have two basic comments and some remarks at the end. Fundamentally on what speculative urbanism actually is, but also on what it not is, because I think we need some more clarification to actually get some leverage out of the concept, to use a term of finance. But before I start, I want to start with a personal, an example of my hometown, or the area I grew up at, which is northern Germany, and it's the city of Bremerhaven. I don't know how many of you know the city. It's a seaport city of 110,000 people. And when I went to school close to it in the 80s, it was already in depression. High unemployment, devastating economic situation. And I was there this winter again, and when I was driving through the city, I heard on the radio that it had reached a new record. Now it is the city in all of Germany, East and West combined, with the highest percentage of under 18-year-olds living in households of poverty, recipients of Hartz IV. And it's over 40% of the young children that live in these households. I think what that shows us is that not everywhere where we see these devastating effects, we find speculative urbanism as an explanation. One could rather speculate whether speculative urbanism will be the answer in Bremerhaven to fix the problems. But that's speculation. But what we see is that the local elites have failed. There's no doubt. And it's a place that has always been a global city. It's a fishery port. It has been the port where the immigrants left for America, and now it's the port where we ship our cars to the world. So it's always been a hub, and you speak of the hub and spoke, and it's one of these hub places. But you can have these places without speculative urbanism that go down, and I think we can benefit from looking at the concept more clearly to understand what's actually going on, because there are other places that managed better. Bilbao was one such example that also were in a post-industrial crisis, and they partnered up with an American museum chain, one could say, the Guggenheim, hired a well-known architect, Frank Gehry, and he built a fantastic museum, and it worked. I assume that was speculative urbanism. I don't know the financial flows, but it's possible. That would be my point. This is potentially, but they still do it. And Hamburg did it with the Elbphilharmonie. It was a financial disaster, but it still works. So we see cities erecting these landmarks, trying to draw on tourism, as you say, making them global cities. The future is what is the problem here, and it's exactly as you say. I think it's not about ownership anymore, but it's on financial flows. And if we want to understand the dynamics and the distribution behind these new effects, this is something we can work with and get some leverage out of, I think. But the question is, and that's my first question to you, if we look at financial flows, and I think they are the key to understand these dynamics, how do we actually do research on financial flows? It's not so easy. It's very complicated in terms of the data. What kind of data do we need? What kind of methods do we need? Do we need interdisciplinary collaboration? Do we need new disciplines? Do we need financial ethnography? Would be very interesting, but I think it's complex and hard to do. Do we need to look at certain sectors? Housing is one, but maybe housing is so obvious we have to look at other sectors such as infrastructure or perhaps something even completely different. And what do we do with institutions? Because I think institutions still matter. The US bankruptcy cases of Stockton and other cities wouldn't be possible in Germany. There's a different institutional framework for good and bad. So I share the thought to overcome methodological nationalism. I think that's something we need to tackle. But how do we keep institutions as a viable explanatory factor while we want to overcome institutional methodological institutionalism? Nationalism, sorry. Methodological nationalism. Getting confused by these terms, which shows how complex it is, perhaps. There's another aspect on financial flows, and that's my second point, which is the actor constellations around these flows. I think you pointed rightfully to the big financial conglomerates that you named, the Blackstones, the others. One could probably say it's the capital providers that matter. But I think there is a crucial missing link, which is the service industry around these capital providers, because we don't really have a shortage of capital. That's perhaps the irony of the 21st century. We have too much capital. And you're right, it goes where the profit rate is highest. So there's still this competition game going on, absolutely true. But I think to be able to actually extract profit from the future, which is what is going on, I totally agree. So it's not ownership anymore of assets that this model is based on, but it's the commercialization, and you call it assetization and liquidation, of future profit streams that are being made use of in the present. But it's a complex, a sophisticated business that's very difficult actually to set in place, and you need an army of financial services firms and other services firms. You need consultancies on the ground, but also in the financial world. You need real estate developers. You need building corporations. You need lawyers. You need investment bankers. You need auditors. You need valuators. So you need these jobs that have become very much desired jobs in the global north. And if you think of London, this is London's asset, and there's not much else. And these people exist, and that could be one explanation that after the crisis they just turn to somewhere else to apply their craft, because it is a craft in some sense. So I think if we look at actor groups, it helps us to analyze what is actually their source of authority. Why does it work? Why do they get the business deals done they want to get done? And I think it's three sources of authority that they offer, or they have to offer or rely on perhaps. It's professionalism. Within their fields, it's state-of-the-art work they do, and they recognize each other as the professionals to enact these activities. It is also trust. They trust each other, but we also trust them. We trust the lawyers that draft these contracts. And it's, last but not least, it's knowledge. You need a specific apparatus of ideas and knowledge and apply it to actually be able to turn Bangalore into this giant construction site. And I think we should be much more critical with these service industry sectors, or actors rather, and hold them accountable and show them the responsibility they exercise. So that brings me to my final question. With regard of with respect to the conceptual issues, what speculative urbanism actually is, and how we can, not only how we can study it, but how we can think of it before we study it, because I think it is a valuable tool to take things further. And the questions that I have is actually strategies to narrow it down from different sides. Is if we can say something about typical constellations in which speculative urbanism unfolds. And I think you named some of the criteria, and it would be worthwhile to think this through more systematically. It's about favorable and unfavorable conditions to these dynamics. And it's mechanisms, and one can be very precise, mechanisms of profit extraction that are in part new, but in part old and being recombined. And there are specific instruments. That's very important. It's innovations in the financial, and you manage interest rate swaps, there are many others. So specific instruments that are used to speculate, while one of their initial purposes was to hedge. And I think if we are able to tell them apart perhaps a bit more, and not by the financial industry's story that it's all about hedging, while it's about speculation, trying to actually narrow it down in that sense. And then to get to legal prescriptions, and one of the issues you raised yourself, I think is very important. It's about the distribution of risk. Who actually carries the risk? Because there are still risks connected to these activities, but they're taken out of the commercial circuit. And they're being offloaded with us or with people on the ground. And I think that could be helpful in addition to maybe some classifications on which types of actors, which types of instruments, which types of dynamics should we be interested in to understand this phenomenon. Thank you.
Do I press this? Hello? I'll be really brief so that we can open it up, okay? Is that okay? Oh, thank you, Sebastian. That's wonderful. I won't get at everything, but I will think about everything, particularly on my plane ride home. But maybe I'll, the method part, which will hopefully help me define a little bit what speculative urbanism is and what it's not. My colleague and friend Karen Ho, I said, wrote a brilliant ethnography of Wall Street called Liquidated. And when I talk about this, she has no idea what I'm talking about. So there's more than one, and it's not because I'm esoteric, it's because finance is so large. She studies the way in which firms, all types of firms, become financialized. That is, their board of directors come from Wall Street, or the equivalent. They start depending upon their success by share price. So every quarter, there's all these mechanisms in which finance capital works to financialize the economy, which I'm not talking about. There's large swaths that I won't get into, but I think they're related. So it's just it's like an attractive, I like to think it's an attractive kind of catchphrase, speculative urbanism. I made it up, or maybe someone else made it up. But I like the term urbanism because it's about idioms, it's about discourses, it's about life experiences and the way in which we become speculative. The way in which, when my students from the University of Minnesota, when they graduated 30 years ago, they expected they work at a company like their parents did for 30 years or something, right? Now, forget it. They have it's not even part of their mindset. In fact, many of them know that the income that they will get, wages or salaries, will not be enough to live on. So they already know that they have to speculate. Got that? The way in which the cultural shift has happened, and to live in a city is a particular kind of shift, a cultural phenomenon that I think I'm trying to capture in this idea of speculative urbanism. That is that most of the professional class in the people that I spoke to in Bangalore, of the professional class, were also talking about their parents' houses, how they had to figure out how to sell it before the developer would come and take it. In the old part of town. So even professionals, not just the poor farmers, we're part of that kind of cultural phenomenon, realizing if we want to live in the city and prosper, then we have to figure out how to sell our house on the market. And much of the housing that's being built in Bangalore, but also in Berlin, are for people who have yet to come. So there's this kind of volatility that I think is instilled that is very cultural and sociological and much more than the narrow, boring stuff about interest rate swaps. But I was trained, and I felt when I was living in Bangalore that I needed to do, this is the methodological part, called follow the money. When I found out that most of the money was coming from outside of Bangalore, I said, why would somebody with a euro economy invest in a rupee economy? It's poor. How can you make money? So then the question becomes, how can the city become attractive to the euro economy? And to do that, you have to kick out all the kind of vitality of the city and make it into that kind of futuristic, that future revenue stream, basically. And so, you're a financial expert, and so I have to say that I'm giving you a very fuzzy definition, but I felt that the world is too complex for my brain and to narrow down into a particular kind of definition. How's that for fuzzy? But so I'm not focusing on the whole world, and finance capital is not focusing on the whole world. I haven't mentioned all the other hundreds of cities in Germany that finance capital is avoiding, right? But the curiosity is, your hometown, how is it preparing itself for the future investor? But I'm saying that if we look at Berlin, and I've got some slides, right? In the last, decade, the rents went up 60%. It's the most expensive city in terms of price increase in the whole of Germany. Why? How? It's not just because it's the most beautiful city in Germany. So the question is, the magic, we have to get behind the magic and the mystery of financial markets. It's just a bunch of guys. So how the hell are they making so much money? Does that sound too banal for a sophisticated intellectual like you? So that's one thing. The other thing is that I noticed that, and this is not a denigration at all, is that I learned a lot of this from housing activists. But housing activists have no idea about most of what I just talked about. And so I do give a lot of talks to housing activists. So I feel there's a division of labor. There's so much that I don't know. But when I spend time in India, there is a kind of element of expertise that I have that I can offer, which people don't have. And so that's the only way we can survive in this very local global world, is to kind of share through a division of labor certain little bits of expertise we all have. I got all my inspiration from the farmers because they explained to me exactly the process of dispossession, which then I could abstract to Goldman Sachs. So let's see if I have one more point. And that is, the last thing I want to say, and to the housing rights activists in the audience, is that is the phrase that I'm using, which is the government has been reduced to what I call government by contract. That is, most financial deals are done in a small room like this once upon a time, with 4 people, and the contract is proprietary, which means it's not available to the public. And in that contract determines what kind of guarantees the city gives, where the direction of public housing will go, and et cetera. How the guarantee for the profit rate. And that is, in my opinion, the site of political action. If we can publicize and demand publicizing these contracts on public goods, you're basically going to chase these people away, because there's no way in hell they're going to invest in a place like Berlin unless they get this kind of guaranteed rate. Why? Because they can invest in Bangalore. And so much of what I learned through a disclosure by activists that put on the web all these different contracts that showed that when the airport was built, the 3 firms, one was German, one was Swiss, and one was Thai, only built the airport. And they said it clearly in the contract because the airport would not create a profit. It was only because if the state would give them 1,000 acres of land, which means the centrality of dispossession, right? And the patrimonial network that's able to kick these people off. And secondly, an exit strategy, which is that they were guaranteed within 3 years of completion of the airport to disinvest with the profits. And we all know that infrastructure becomes decrepit over time. Its highest value is when it opens up. And that's precisely when the investors got out. Because why? Because it said it in the contract. And they would... The truth. So I just talk about it as a methodology, follow the contract, but also as a political strategy. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have a recipe for resistance already, but more questions? Many more questions. Let's start from here. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
We'll take several.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you. I really enjoyed this lecture, and I wish I would have been more familiar with your work because I just completed my thesis in non-speculative land management. It was done on a much smaller scale, of course. So kind of what that means is alternative methods to speculative land management. And I was just wondering because mine was really centralized in just neighborhoods, I was wondering if you had any alternatives to the speculative urbanism.
Thanks. Let's take more.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Julia. Thank you very much for your talk, and also to you, Sebastian. My background used to be in investment banking, so Frankfurt and the City of London till 2002. Then I saw the light, saw how horrible it was, and now I'm working in business ethics. One thing about Bilbao, that would be the worst case scenario for Bremen if you want to kill off Bremerhaven, follow the Bilbao model, just as a side remark. But I was wondering, Michael, why you didn't take this one step further and highlight all the influence Goldman Sachs has on all the financial authorities by now, how the people from Goldman Sachs directly move into the financial departments of governments, even here in Germany. Even here we have a supposedly social democrat as a finance minister. He took in more Goldman Sachs people because there weren't obviously enough yet. So they make sure that the lawmakers are not able to change anything. They reaffirm the thinking that this is the only way, that there is no alternative into everybody who is working there. And I was curious why, when you went so deep into the other steps, you didn't even mention that. Is there a reason for that?
Okay, thank you for those questions, and I'll try to be brief. One example which comes from the United States, and there are others all over the world, is what we call community land trusts. Have you heard of that? And so it basically means, okay, well, one example was in Florida, and the other is in New York City, actually, where a group of housing rights activists, including homeless people, homeless activists too, took over abandoned buildings and pressured in very poor neighborhoods, right? Not in downtown Wall Street, and insisted that the city basically give it to them, and that is that the city would own the land, and the community would manage the property. And in that way, there's no way to speculate. There's no way to profit. There's like a guarantee of some sort that the community, and that means, that's a question, you know, what's the community? But neighborhood activists would rebuild the building because the government owned the land, they could borrow money from the government, and yet nobody could profit from it. So they're called community land trusts. They're being talked about across the United States. That is taking, you know, Detroit, 1/3 of Detroit is completely empty. So Blackstone is there actually, but the idea is to take land and dilapidated buildings, and you call it squatting, right? But for us, it's called community land trust, and negotiate with the city as a way to borrow money to develop. Now this may sound like gentrification, right? But gentrification is different. That is that there's no landowner to make money from the increased value, and that's what activists are trying. It's small, but trying it, yeah. Oh.
I'm super familiar with the land trust. And I mean, from my understanding though, do you believe that that land trust could kind of scale up in a way to, I mean, it was very community-based and neighborhood-based, and that was really what my focus was on my thesis, but just talking in a global manner, do you feel like it could be scaled up?
Well, I think anything's possible, right? I mean, look, finance scaled up over the last 50 years in ways that nobody would have predicted. So I can imagine the opposite can happen. I mean, it's home, it's place, you got to believe, right? And your question, I mean, it's not a question, it's a statement, it's right, and I didn't talk about it. I felt it was, if you will, it was kind of the unhidden part. But I mean, our horrific president in the United States, I mean, he wanted to drain the swamp and he filled it with Wall Street people, But if you look, I wrote a book on the World Bank. Every single World Bank president was a Wall Street banker. So it's not hidden, but you're right, it's important. And that was my there they are. That the three of these guys work in the Treasury Department, okay. But I really appreciate your point.
Hi, my name is Asim. I just want to say something here. So states have goals. They want to be present on the national stage, on the global stage. What they want to do is just unlock the resources that they have in their urban areas. They want to expand their cities and they want to establish their presence on the global stage. The thing is, when they unlock these resources, the best of using these resources have the monopoly on this market. What I mean is that, okay, when you open the market for housing, for example, the best of getting to this market and using the resources in this market will have the monopoly on this market. So how do you fight this phenomena? On the other hand, how do you protect people from this phenomena? Because one way or another, you will have monopoly. That's it.
Hi, I'm Dieter Plewer here from the WZB. Michael, the last point on the newly invented patrimonial regime of actors just made me think first of Janine Wedel's presentation here a number of months ago, where she discussed basically the relevance of global elites for the present sort of like development of capitalism. And in a way, unfortunately, her research, great research on the relevance of all kinds of elites that interlock in important ways between finance, academia, politics, and so on, is relatively American. And to my taste, the sort of like the claim to show the relevance of a globalized relevance was missing. And I'm wondering if you can say something about the sort of like, I mean, because here your picture again was pretty much a US picture. But the claim that this is a really relevant dimension, and if you indeed in this kind of globalized world, we, I guess, require a very strong dimension of a transnational and indeed global elite. And it made me think, is it really so new? Because of course we had predecessors in previous ages of capitalism, namely the Rotary Club, the Lions Club, and all kinds of other elite networks that of course were much more based in, I guess, trade and in industry, whereas now we obviously see maybe a predominance of finance. But so this is my question. And then on the methods, I was thinking, I totally sort of like agree that a great way to pursue this research, even if complicated to hell, is follow the money. I'm only wondering, to come closer to what Sebastian suggested, that there's this need, apart from capital, liquid capital to flow, that you need a host of relevant service agents to secure those flows between the interests of the specifics of the real estate industry, the finance industry. Local government, you know, is basically another field of expertise. And I was wondering, since we need fixers that sort of like link these different expert elite circles, do we maybe have a point in following the people in addition to following the money? Do we find sort of like interesting individuals that we can try to search, and maybe they're easier to follow than the money?
About following the people, what do these characters say if you ask them what they're doing? Are they totally insensitive? Do they block this out? Do they try to rationalize this in some way? What do they say? If they heard you, this presentation of yours, what would they say?
Well, those are two different questions. The first question, I have interviewed a number of people in this industry, and I don't present myself in the way that I presented in this talk. But part of it is because I'm writing the book now, and thanks to the invitation, I just tried to come together and say, okay, what is this damn book about, you know? And so that's what I presented partly today. But I hadn't thought about it while I was interviewing people. But you know, okay, so I interviewed this this Indian financial banker who said, look, he said to me, he said, you know, I read by candlelight in my village, you know. That's how poor we were, you know, rural India. And he said, I see an opportunity here. He said, I know there's a lot of vultures out there. That's an expression that they even use about vulture capital. But, you know, what we're trying to do is get the best advice, get the best, to, you know, kind of up the game in India. Because, what the World Bank always says is it's the last mile. In India, they invest in dams and power plants and infrastructure, but somehow it doesn't ever work. And that they always say it's the last mile, and it's because of corruption or bribery or inefficiency. And I don't buy those arguments, because I don't see inefficient people who live on $1 a day. People who use a bucket of water are incredibly efficient. I don't see inefficiency anywhere, even though the World Bank officials do. So there's a cognitive dissonance here. And so what he imagines is this finance capital will disrupt the culture of India in order so that India could become more like Europe. And, as Gandhi once said, if Europe, look how much of the world Europe consumed. If India were to become like Europe, there would be no world, right? And so I don't think the model is Europe for India, and I think that's very colonial. So part of the network of people is that they've been trained by Harvard Business School or the equivalent. I've been in Hyderabad, there is a training institute for professional class government officials who are trained in cost-benefit analysis in this sort. How do you unlock resources and create future revenue streams, blah, 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 blah. So it's not that they don't have a heart, but they live in this world where everybody is moving and making money, and they're seduced by it, and they don't see the alternative. And part of the culture of that seduction is to make invisible or denigrate the normal. Which is colonial discourse, in my opinion. Colonialism could never happen if you didn't create the other. If white was not superior, that's how we created the colonized. And in that way, I'm simplifying, but in that way, interesting enough, the old story about finance capital, which I'm writing in my book, finance capital, the railways, the fourth largest railway system in the world were built by the British in India in the late 1800s, early 1900s, right? The railways, according to the original documents, British Parliament would not have built it. Railway companies would not have built it. The East India, companies would not have built it without a guarantee by the state that there would be a guaranteed rate of return of 5%. Secondly, that the profits on the railway system did not come from the cotton that was produced in the descent to Manchester a la Marx, right? That created the Industrial Revolution. No, the profit that was made from the railways was from Lloyd's of London and the Bank of England that were the major investors that lent the money to the construction companies that built the railways. And it was only because the Indians gave their land for free, forced to gave their labor for free, forced to, that it became profitable for finance capital to make money off the railways. And if you look closely at the people who looked at the accounts, the railways lost money. So it's the same illiquid. The thing that India could have needed the most, the railways, was unprofitable until finance capital got a guarantee by the state that they could export that money. And you know where that money went? To pay British bills in France and Germany and the United States, because the British Empire financially was so far in debt because of its land conquest that it had to generate this finance profit in order to pay its bills. So all of a sudden, debt and finance was the motor of keeping the British Empire afloat. And what was that based on? Dispossession of land and labor in, among other places, India. And the arbitrage, just to continue, was, and why did they want to build the railways? Because the cotton prices, because of the American South and the Civil War, were so high that the British couldn't make money off processing, clothing. So they needed, in a sense, arbitrage to have a cheaper product of cotton coming from India. So you could see the way in which finance capital has been around for a long time. What's new? Maybe nothing. The grand historians would laugh at me, but I think that a tremendous amount has changed in the last 30 years, and that's what I've been trying to document, and others have been documenting better. What they would say to me is that they believe in the dream, and we have to dream. And there's a lot of poverty in India, and there's a lot of inequality in Germany. So and the discourse, as he described, and I'll get to his point, is to unlock resources. There's a famous set of books and prophecies that came out of the World Bank. How do you unlock resources in the global south so that they could become wealthy like the north? And these are the financial tools. We're keeping them poor if we don't give them these financial tools. That whole colonial discourse. But unlock resources is the question for whom? If you're taking somebody's house to unlock a resource, for whom? That's the problem. Unlocking resources to pay off debts. You know, that the problem is the resources have to be people have to be dispossessed from the resources in order for the profit to be made. The whole argument from the World Bank is the rural is pathetically in the 19th century to find profit in countries that are 70% rural is to turn that land into urban real estate and to capitalize agriculture, forgetting the fact that hundreds of millions of people depend upon agriculture for their livelihoods. And finance in India produced 21 jobs last year. And then, you know, you get the point. Follow the people. Yeah, I mean, I think follow the networks. So I've been able to follow the classes that have been taught in these training institutes to realize the way in which the gospel has been disseminated. And Dieter's other point, which I think is very important, is this is not a U.S. story. That really long, boring paper I wrote was to make the point that the financial crisis did not start in the U.S., that this is totally relational. And that's the point. Finance capital can't work in one country. And that's how the financial crisis spread, and the afterlife of the financial crisis became such a transnational product. And I think I have to stop.
Just a very brief addition to what you just said. I think it's not only for whom do we unlock the resources, but how do we unlock them? Because then the question is there an alternative to finance capitalism? I think it would be possible to have markets without finance capitalism. And there were times when that was the predominant mode. So it's about not only for whom do we unlock, but how do we unlock?
I think before we move the discussion to the drinks and snacks, I really want to thank both of you for all these insights, and I'm really still stunned by also this attitude of, I can't believe what I'm telling you, that you're like carrying through all your research over all these years, and thanks for digging deeper, Sebastian, and to all of you, and have a great evening.
Thank you for coming.